I've been back in Michigan State a couple of times, David, and for one thing and another over the course of the last 40 years. And I find it just shocking what a beautiful campus
Oh,
that
it was
is.
gorgeous.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's a great place. It was beautiful. Absolutely.
People don't tend to know it like they know it about Cornell or Princeton or something.
Yeah.
Wow.
All set?
I'm ready. Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. My guest today is one of the country's most knowledgeable journalists on the subjects of taxation and business. He is David K. Johnston of the New York Times. He has written a new book called Free Lunch: How the Wealthiest Americans Enrich Themselves at Government Expense and Stick You with the Bill. His book deals with the methods by which the already wealthy have used government since approximately 1980 to make themselves richer and richer, while the rest of us fall further and further behind. David K. Johnston is with me today, of course, to discuss his book. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of MSL. David, thank you for coming up from Rochester.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's the second time you've been on the show. And we would have taped this a few days ago, but for the northeastern winter,
Yeah.
which grounded you. David, I gather that after many years of a very, I think it's fair to say, a very distinguished career, part of it being with the Los Angeles Times, one of the country's fine newspapers, part of it being with the New York Times, one of the country's fine newspapers. You are in April going to leave the New York Times for the purpose of writing books and some magazine articles, but basically to work on books. Is that right?
Yeah, I've been doing this for more than 40 years. I'm not even 50 years old yet, but I've been doing it more than 40 years, and it's time to go
You're not even 50?
Not even 60
Not
yet.
even 60, yeah.
And I want to go do books full time, do some long form magazine articles, documentaries, possibly theatrical film, based on the kind of work I've been doing about the disconnect
Yeah.
between our political culture and the reality of our economy.
I noticed over the weekend when I watched you, I think actually about 1.5 times, because we TiVo'd it. We don't have a TiVo, but we got the equivalent. When you were on C-SPAN, and you mentioned that you wanted to write more extensively about some things than you had been able to in the past, or that many, and even now you said that you yourself did a lot more research into these things and into the reality of what the politicians are talking about than most reporters do.
Right.
What causes you, David, to do so much more digging, so much more research, both the book kind, you do a lot of booking in your work, as well as a lot of human investigating. Why do you do that and other reporters don't?
Well, you have to have lots of different kinds of reporters to make a newspaper work. You know, you need to have people who can cover sports and people who can write features, people who can write funny. Very important to have people who can write funny. And when I was a young man, discovered I could make more money as a teenager writing for a newspaper than anything else that was open to me. One of the things I quickly learned was that there were two kinds of reporters. There were reporters who came to work and had a note in their typewriter that said, "This is what you're to go do today." And there were reporters who told their editors, "This is what I'm going to go do today." And I quickly decided that I'd rather be in that group. And when I would sit in meetings of city councils and school boards and things like that I covered in my early years, I began to realize that if you started digging into how the government really operated, it was really quite interesting. And that the superficial blather of the politicians, the city council members, the supervisors, or whatever, you could write fun stories about it, but the real substance was how the quality of people's lives was affected by the quality of their government, and how the distribution of resources was affected by the government. Things don't happen in a vacuum. And so I took a deep interest in that, and I was also interested in the exercise of power. One of the things that I've observed through life is that, you know, some people don't care about beauty, some people don't care about money, some people don't care about power. People who care about power can do enormous damage to a society. They're very hard for journalists generally to write about, and you had to really focus on understanding exactly what people were doing and never make mistakes of any consequence if you were going to do that. And I just found it challenging and interesting.
David, at the risk of asking you to discuss the obvious, why is it that they're hard to write about, and why is it that you must never make mistakes?
Well, the first reason it's hard to write about is that what's the point of gathering power if you can't abuse it? Use it for your own interests, okay? But people are not.
There is none.
But people who are into power are also smart about trying to hide what they're doing to persuade you that they're really doing it for your benefit.
Right.
We need to temporarily have a dictatorship because the people need this, not I need this.
Yes.
So you have to watch very carefully for their behavior and the acts they take and to piece them together. And there's no outside force telling you to do that. If you were writing about most news, all you have to do is accurately record the official version of events of what happened in your state. The news media does a really good job of that. What the president said yesterday, what took place in the debate in Congress, the airplane that fell out of the sky, those are all well covered. The things that are sub rosa, that are subtext, those are not nearly so well covered. And they're difficult to cover. The reason you can't make mistakes, I have watched all throughout my career my peers, many of them have done well, but I've watched a number of them blow up. They had some serious error in a story, or the story was fine, but when the inevitable attacks on them came, they mishandled the attacks. And so I've always been very careful about making sure that you're fair to people. And one of the ways I do that is when I'm writing a story, I imagine to myself that I'm the person who is the focus of this story. And I may be getting my skin flayed, but did I have it coming, and was it fair, and did I do my best to tell their version of the events, even if they won't talk to me?
Yeah.
Did I do my best to tell their version of the events? And those rules will generally keep you out of trouble. They won't keep you out of controversy, and I can introduce you to people, Larry, who will tell you that I'm the greatest person they ever met in their life because they're not in prison for a crime they didn't commit or something else, and I can introduce you to a lot more people who will tell you I'm the biggest jerk and the worst person in the world they ever met.
Comes with the territory. David, apropos of that, let me ask you your opinion, if you're willing to give it, about a subject that has been much in the news during the 10 days before this taping, which is March 4th, March 3rd. Today's March 4th. It's funny, you look at your watch, but the date is on the watch. The Times did a story about John McCain. And the news media in general, starting with cable television, inmediatamente, as they say in Spanish, if not sooner, started blasting the Times for writing this story and pretending, that's my word, pretending that what the Times was writing about was a sex scandal, when it seemed to me that what the Times was writing about was hypocrisy and inconsistency, and that sex, if it occurred, was only part of a much bigger picture. The Times caught its lunch for that because, of course, McCain and his people and those who support him didn't want any of this coming out. What's your opinion, if you're willing to give it, on who was right and who was accurate in terms of what the story was about?
Well, I didn't have anything to do with that story at all, Larry.
I know that.
There are a couple of things I think that are kind of clear about it. I mean, I read it like any other reader did. One of them is that the story probably would have benefited a great deal if the line had said there were a couple of staff members who believed there was something romantic, which was the phrase, going on, and had pointed out that there was no evidence of this, but they believed it, and it explained their motivation as opposed to the facts. But more importantly, the story was in fact about whether John McCain is how most people perceive him to be. Yeah. And in that sense, it was not unlike the stories that have been done on every other candidate, where there are these long pieces into which an enormous amount of work that you don't see goes into these stories to examine the backgrounds and lives and activities of the candidates. And there was a lot of substance in that story. And the very morning the Times story came out, it went up on the internet the night before, the Washington Post was able to take and cobble together the material it had on the same subject and have a matching story the next morning. So it wasn't that others weren't looking at this. And for any candidate, comparing what you say to what you do is just standard practice. There seems to me that there's also an effort in this country by some people to see to it that the only news you get is the official version of events.
Yeah.
I'm in the business of the unofficial version of events.
Yeah.
I've spent my whole career on the unofficial version of events. But all across America, you will see attacks on news organizations for perfectly valid, well-reported stories. And many of the attacks come from people who clearly either have not read the story,
Right.
or they're being dishonest about it. And I would cite another example. The Los Angeles Times had a very carefully reported story with women whom it named who said they had been sexually harassed by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Even though there were only named women in the story, and many of them had been reluctant to talk. They were not out seeking publicity. The LA Times lost something like 1% of its subscribers, and there were these massive attacks on them claiming that they were used unnamed sources.
Right.
People clearly who didn't read the story. And I think this is a troubling development in our democracy. I think you want to have newspapers that are aggressive watchdogs of government and government officials and people who exercise power. Do newspapers sometimes make mistakes or get it wrong? Sure we do. There's a reason it's called the first rough draft of history.
Yeah.
But if you read the paper over a period of days, or multiple papers, which is even better, as your and my parents always did, and people of that generation, you will get a pretty good picture of what the government's doing, and government is central to the quality of our lives.
Yeah.
Government sets the rules, and the rules define the civilization.
You know, it's an example of something, part of what you talked about strikes me as an example of something you talk about extensively in the book, which we will get to. I'm just so interested in some of the other things that you have to say also. The vast reduction in concern for honesty, accuracy, and competence. When you talk about people blasting the Los Angeles Times for using unnamed sources when its sources are named, when you talk about people blasting the New York Times for allegedly writing an article about unproven sex when it's really about inconsistency and hypocrisy, you're just talking about people who don't give a tinker's damn about honesty or accuracy.
Well, there actually are some people, I believe, who are essentially paid to manufacture ways to attack the news media. One of the salient things I think we've seen happen in this country is a rise of a rise largely among the people who call themselves conservatives, of being statists. The other day I was watching a program on Fox News where the anchor referred to the Republicans as we. I noticed nobody wrote a piece about that. Imagine if Dan Rather, and I don't know what party he's in, but had referred to one party or the other and said we.
God forbid it should have been we Democrats. My God.
But the thrust of the point being made was that someone had, the British government had asked that something not be reported, and some journalist somewhere had reported this. And the thrust of it was, well, you know, you weren't being patriotic. You weren't silent when the government told you to.
Yeah.
Well, that's not my understanding of the idea of patriotism. That doesn't mean this may or may not have been a mistake to do, but the First Amendment was adopted at a time when newspapers had no regard for facts. They were, in fact, made things up. John Adams was accused of all sorts of horrible crimes, for example, that he never committed in misconduct. And yet they passed the First Amendment. They adopted the idea that having a robust public discussion would advance this, at the time, radical idea that we could govern ourselves. And you know, you live over if you're a journalist, you sign all your work. There's a saying in my business, lawyers see their mistakes off to jail, doctors bury theirs, only reporters sign theirs on the front page for everyone to read. And the only thing you have to sell is your reputation about that. And over the long haul, your reputation will stand or fall. But this notion that you should bow down before the government, that you should not report things, that we should allow courts to seal records and conduct government in private, that we should say we're going to give money to this or that party, but you can't know how much of your tax dollars were spent or how because of confidential business reasons. That should be deeply offensive, I would think, to people who understand the theory of why we created America.
Well, you know, and you can extend that, and on other shows I have and we will in the future, to executive privilege and the state secret privilege. People in power don't, and in fact it's true in corporations, it's true in universities, in police, it's true everywhere. People don't want you to know what they're doing because it won't, you know the old saying, David, If you don't want to see it on the, if you think you wouldn't want to see it on the front page of the New York Times, don't do it.
Don't do it.
Yeah, well, they do it, but they still don't want to see it on the front page of the New York Times. And this attacking journalists, this goes back, well, it goes back, of course, as you say, to the 1790s. Jefferson actually paid some guy. I forgot, it wasn't Fernald, it was the other guy. He actually paid some guy to go out and attack the administration of which he was a part. He did it secretly.
And we had the Alien and Sedition Acts at one time. Well, we used to have commercial criminal libel laws. We've gotten rid of those.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that you need to have journalists who do many different things.
Yeah.
You need to cover sports, you need to have funny stories, but you need to have a significant core of journalists whose job is to be skeptical about the government's operations, to tell you not what the politicians say, but what the government actually is doing.
Yeah.
And we will be better off in the long run, I believe, if we do that, because it's a funny thing. Truth tends to lead to better policies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, David, I'm not going to ask you to comment on what I'm going to say because I don't think it would be fair to ask you to comment. But then I will ask you something in which I will ask you to comment. I think that Bill Keller and Arthur Sulzberg are incompetent. When
I don't agree with you about that at all.
Okay, let me tell you my latest reason, if I may put it that way. When the story about McCain came out, Keller published some kind of statement at the time. This had gone through many drafts, and it was the usual way, and this is what always happens, and they printed it when it was ready. Well, and that's the kind of stuff he talked about with regard, for example, to the breaking of the news about the NSA spying, which they actually sat on for 1 year. It would have had a dramatic impact possibly on the election had they not done that, but be that as it may. But he didn't say word one about, in this last time, he did not say word one about what you and I have been talking about, which is this wasn't about sex. This was about inconsistency and acting contrary to what you've been preaching.
Okay. I'm not a spokesperson for the Times, okay? But as an individual and somebody who's been in the top ranks of journalism as a reporter for a long time, the most important person in a newspaper, if you're a reporter, is not the editor, it's the publisher.
Yeah.
If the publisher doesn't have any spine or backbone, then you don't get things in the paper. And I worked at the Los Angeles Times when Otis Chandler was there, and the editors would go say, we're going to run this story tomorrow, and he would say, thank you, and they ran whatever they felt they needed to run. And I worked there afterwards when publishers sort of went, yeah, and this self-censorship came into the paper, and it was very damaging. And I was the first person to leave over that kind of nonsense. About 24 of us eventually left. Arthur is faced in a very tough environment. This isn't the nice, easy profits era of the past for newspapers where they were printing money. They've been enormously successful at moving towards the internet, the size of the audience, the influence of the Times, and up until just recently, while everybody else has been cutting, they were adding to the staff. Bill, who has been running the paper now since the short, brief, unhappy reign of Howell Raines, has had to make a lot of tough choices. But for example, on the story you mentioned on national security, which I know nothing about except as a reader, I do know from my experience that editors all the time say to reporters, you don't have it. You think you have it, you don't have it. Just like prosecutors say to detectives, you don't have it yet. Go back and do more work. And in that case, my recollection is the reporter, the principal reporter on that story, took a leave to write a book. And during the course of that, developed more material, and then they felt you had it. You don't publish a story till you think it's ready. I've many times thought I had a story ready to go, and I am very glad now that some editor said, I put the hoop up here, you haven't jumped through it yet, go back and do more work. So I've never met an editor I had any respect for who would time a story or care about the election. We run the story when we run the story. We don't say, oh, we're going to get this in print. There are certain events that are coming up. You're going to write about the 50th anniversary of something. You better have it there by the 50th anniversary. But for almost all news stories, it's when you're ready to go, you go with it. And by the way, they published the story. Nobody else published that story, and we now know it was right on.
It was more than right on. All right, we will gentlemanly agree to disagree on that particular story. And you know, I have to say that I think the Times, and one of the reasons I get so angry about what I see as big mistakes, what I see as big mistakes, obviously not everybody sees it my way, viz. What you've just said, is that I think the Times is a national treasure. And, you know,
there's no other newspaper in its league. I've worked for 5 big papers, the San Jose Mercury, the Detroit Free Press, the LA Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the New York Times, and I have good friends at the other top papers in this country, and the Times is in a league by itself. I believe the Times is absolutely vital if we're going to maintain the liberties of the people as a check on the abuse of power by government.
You know, that's a very strong statement. I agree with it. I think it's almost a criminal shame that we are at a point in this country where if a single newspaper were to go down, or if its people are to be affected by the pressure that's put on them all the time, it just means that our democracy could be in ever bigger trouble. We have a single lifeline. If you ask me, this is a very bad thing.
Well, I mean, there are other forces at work, but among newspapers, you know, a lot of people look at the world as they're born into it and assume, like Dr. Pangloss, that it must needs be that this is the way God intended the world to be. It is nowhere written down that we will have our liberties, that we will have the freedoms that we have come to know. And there is a never-ending struggle against the need for the state to be strong enough to be functional and to have a civilized society, and at the same time its desire to crush those who stand in the way. Prior to our Constitution and Bill of Rights, I think the historic problem for the inconvenient individual was predation by the state.
Yeah.
The king doesn't like you, throw him in Chateau d'If. The king wants your daughter when she's a virgin, you don't want to hand her over, cut the guy's throat. And one of the great geniuses of our Constitution was the recognition that the liberties of the people depended on a certain set of standards, habeas corpus being a crucial one, the ability to speak your mind, the ability to follow or not follow religion as you chose. And that when we put these in place, we have this flourishing society. It's not perfect. We got lots of things wrong in our society. Government has problems. I spent my whole life writing about what's wrong with government, but there is no civilization. There is no liberty without government. And to the extent that people have said, well, I don't care what the government's doing, you know, I'm much more interested in, you know, did Brittany get drunk last night? Who is Paris sleeping with this week? And not with what the government's doing. Then politicians fall under the influence of other people. And in our age, they have fallen heavily under the influence of their donors because of gerrymandered districts that this year is an exception, but historically only about 8 congressional districts per election have been competitive in your and my lifetime as adults. And therefore, the real constituency of members of Congress are the political donors. And we've seen how money brokers and efforts at campaign finance reform have made things worse and worse and worse, so that we have a government that is increasingly estranged from the needs of the people and focused on the needs of the moneyed people and large corporations. And that's the area I have been working on for years, and part of the reason I'm going to go work on books and things is because I want to do things that are beyond the scope of the daily newspaper. Good as it is and important as it is, I want to explore things on a level that's beyond the scope of even a great newspaper like the New York Times.
Well, now that is what Free Lunch is all about. And let me try something out here on you. I think that while Free Lunch, which is what, 370 pages, whatever it is?
320, I think.
320. Well, maybe 319 and a half are about ways in which the wealthy have since about 1980 used government, as in the Gilded Age of the 19th century, to get richer and richer, while the poor and the middle class, everybody but the top 1% essentially, you know, struggle on at about the same level we were at in 1980. While maybe 319 and a half pages are about that, there's half a page which really resonates with me. This book is, because it makes a point clear that I think is implicit in the rest of the book. This book is really a book about morality, isn't it?
Oh, sure, yes. One of the criticisms I've actually gotten is, you're a reporter, what are you doing writing with a moral tone? And yes, this is a book about political culture and morality. You know, all throughout, I cite Adam Smith, the Bible, and Andrew Mellon as moral authorities in this book. All throughout the Bible.
Everybody will go with the first two. I don't know about the third.
Well, I think it's important that Andrew
Mellon. I understand. Yes.
Andrew Mellon says that people are more important than capital, and people have to be thought of first, not capital, because that's not our culture today. All throughout the Bible, the most frequently denounced evil is taking from the poor to give to the rich. The Bible tells us in both books that your society will come to ruin if you do this. Now, it was written at a time when we didn't know how to create wealth. Remember, Balzac said 200 years ago that behind every great fortune lies a crime.
I know, it's a great comment.
But we know how to create wealth now. The Industrial Revolution created wealth. The information revolution and our ability to manipulate cyberspace and to develop concepts and structures in mathematics and elsewhere, we can create real wealth. So, per se, being wealthy is now not the result of taking from those with less. And yet this historic problem has come roaring back. And it's come roaring back under the guise of conservatism. Conservatism to me means we take the things that we know work and we keep them and we maintain them. And if you want to try something new, you want some new government program or policy, you're careful about it, you're cautious about it, you're skeptical of it. If it turns out it works, we'll try incorporating that. But we have a great skepticism about doing that. Well, that's not what we got. We got radical ideas that no one else in the world is doing. And lo and behold, these other countries are having fewer problems, and their middle class is better off because they didn't do these radical things. They were, in fact, conservative. Now, the things they did we might view as liberal, but they were conservative in hanging on to those things. And so what were we promised in 1980 when Ronald Reagan asked his famous question, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And I'm here asking the question, are you better off than you were in 1980? He said, we'll have less taxes. Well, you know what? Taxes as a share of the economy are the same they were back then. Government spending as a share of the economy hasn't changed one iota.
Except it's higher, absolutely.
Well, what we've got, but not as a share of the economy.
I understand.
And what we've gotten instead is all this government debt. So that now, assuming that all the interest on the federal debt is paid just from the individual income tax, all the income taxes that you pay from January through the end of April just go to pay interest on the national debt. And since 86% of federal tax revenues come from labor and 14% from capital, that means we explicitly have a policy now to tax labor to transfer to capital. All right?
Or to China.
But China's capital.
Yeah. Right.
So we didn't get less government that we were promised. Next, we were told we should have deregulation. There's no such thing as deregulation. Everything has rules. You have rules here at the law school students have to follow. There are rules on what size and shape a stop sign has to be. Baseball has rules right down to how many stitches there are on the baseball. What we got were new regulations. And the new regulations were written by Enron and the railroads and the banks. And they eliminated consumer protections or reduced them. They took away enforcement of the existing laws. They benefited this political donor class who were pursuing their own self-interest. And by the way, I don't have any problem with people pursuing their own self-interest. It's just there's not been a pushback from the rest of society as we have seen unions, which help pushback decline, and other areas where there was pushback decline. Big churches, some of them were involved in this, and we've seen them decline. We were promised that we would have, that markets would provide solutions. Well, you know, a lot of my book is a defense of markets. The Supreme Court says a market is where independent parties, neither under duress or coercion, and with knowledge of the facts, come to an agreement on a price. That's not what a lot of our new markets do. We now have markets designed to thwart competition, to take Adam Smith's invisible hand of the market, in which there are lots of sellers and smart consumers who can compare prices, and this drives prices down, Adam Smith said, to the lowest level at which businesses can continue to operate. We've replaced that through government policies with practices that artificially restrict competition, that raise prices, that inflate profits, all under the guise of conservatism, and markets will solve our problems. Fundamentally, I argue in Free Lunch, what's happened is that a narrow segment of our society, large corporations, which are immortal and amoral.
Right.
They're necessary, they're important, they are great producers of wealth, but there's reasons that you want to regulate and control entities that are both amoral. Their purpose is to maximize return to capital, which is a perfectly good thing to do, but they have no other obligation. and they are immortal. Unless they mess up in the marketplace, they go on forever. Unlike you and I, who our time's going to run out someday. If we
Not
don't,
soon, I hope.
one hopes. Unless we have rules that govern their conduct, they can do enormous damage to our society. And we have had a massive effort to collect subsidies from the government, to get rid of government employees and replace them with private sector workers who typically cost twice as much. So the federal workforce has gone down, and everybody's seen news stories that the federal workforce is shrinking, but the number of people who are paid by the federal government to work is going up, and the cost per person, per labor hour, is going up enormously. And when we do that, by the way, unlike creating a bureaucracy where, empire building bureaucrats, now you have a corporation that makes campaign contributions to encourage more of this and more contracts and more money flowing their direction. So all of the things we were promised, most of them haven't happened. Well, there have been some good things. airfares have fallen. We have a lot more air traffic than we used to have. There have been some benefits. It is not black and white. But my focus is on these areas where we now have massive transfers of wealth and income from those with less to the politically connected few. Billions and billions of dollars being handed up the ladder.
David, it strikes me, as you were talking, a couple of ideas struck me for the first time. What you're discussing is not different, is it, than what was happening in the Great Britain, against which the founders of this country rebelled because monopolies, the East India Company. There were monopolies that Britain, they even let them have private armies, which the East India Company had.
In fact, the East India Company, Larry, is actually fundamental to the American Revolution and is taught the wrong way in American schools. And anybody who's a school teacher, I hope you listen to this. There's a wonderful book called The Boston Tea Party by Professor Larrabee. It came out 40-some years ago, where he went and got the British records of this event and the American records. Every school child in America gets told, I'm sure you did as I did as a child, told this was a protest against high taxes. No, it wasn't. It was a protest against a tax exemption. Sure. It was a protest against a favor, a government tax favor to the politically connected friends of King George, who owned this royal monopoly, the East India Company. They mismanaged it because guess what? In a competitive environment, managers who can't run the business are gotten rid of or they go out of business. But in a monopoly, you can mismanage for a long time, and the same thing with a duopoly and an oligopoly where there's a little scintilla of competition among a few firms. And they were going to go bankrupt because they had all this tea that they couldn't sell, and they were going to replace a market. In Boston, not far from where we are, I think it was 7 out of 10 cups of tea drunk in November and December of 1773 were Dutch tea. But under this law that was being protested, there would be a monopoly, and only British tea could be drunk. Well, people understood that that would eventually mean higher prices, that it would mean less competition. There were lots of little petty merchants who depended on selling tea to make their livelihood at the time. And if we have such a fundamental misunderstanding of how the country got started, then we're going to have fundamentally flawed policies that flow out of these myths. And a lot of what I've been writing about in Free Lunch and my book Perfectly Legal, in the 13 years of stories I've been doing in the New York Times, are about what I see as a growing disconnect between our political and cultural mythology and how the economy actually works.
Yeah.
Now, all societies have to operate from myths. You have to have a shorthand for your culture. But ours is getting disconnected from reality. And I believe one of the reasons that Free Lunch has done so well in the 2 months it's been out is that a lot of people have looked around after 28 years from when they were promised all these things by Ronald Reagan, looked at their circumstances, realized that for the bottom 90% of Americans, incomes are unchanged after 28 years, even though the country is more than twice as wealthy in real terms, and productivity per capita is up 70%. For every dollar the economy put out back then per person in real terms, it puts out $1.70 today. And they've said, where's the beef?
Right.
And that disconnect is, I'm hoping, opening up an opportunity to get people to see what the government has done that's contrary to their interests. Because Adam Smith said, any policy that benefits the majority of people must be a good thing for the society.
David, you've just, over the last 10 minutes, you've actually presented a fair amount of your book, which it'll become more evident to people as we go along that you have done that you've summarized a lot of it very well. I'm going to go, and it seems that every time I bring up a historical point that it gives you another shot at doing it. I'm going to bring up another historical point.
Okay.
Isn't, you say in the book, I believe, and I think I heard you say on television, that what we have is a social system or an economic system that, in reverse of the biblical, takes from the many or from the poor to give to the rich. Now, isn't that exactly one of the major reasons for the French Revolution?
Yes. What happened in France was that the only determinant of your economic life in 18th century France was how well you picked your parents. And trusts and estates and the functional equivalent of what would happen if we repeal the estate tax in the United States occurred, in that all capital and all land, and this was essentially an agrarian society, were tied up. Either the church or trusts controlled so much that there was no movement anywhere. And one of the stories I tell in Free Lunch when I talk about the hedge fund business in the United States and the hedge fund managers who pay taxes at the same rate as janitors in the United States.
Janitors don't pay that much.
15%
I mean,
tax
don't pay
rate.
that little.
Right. They pay a 15% tax rate on their incomes, and that's what hedge fund managers say they should be able to pay.
Yeah, there was some guy who made $1.7 billion. He
Yes.
made Michael Milken look like a piker.
Yes. Well, the average hedge fund manager in 2006, and remember the hedge fund managers keep telling us if you raise our taxes, the whole economy will be negatively affected, said that it was not fair to make them pay more than a 15% rate. Of course, school teachers and reporters tend to pay 25 or 31%. Well-to-do Americans pay 35%. And the top 25 hedge fund managers' average income was only $11 million. I'm sorry, $11 million a week. A week, but they can't afford the taxes.
That's a cool $650 a year.
There is a model of the La Petite Trianon, which was Madame Pompadour's residence and later briefly Marie Antoinette's in Greenwich, Connecticut. And at the time the original was built, there was a room built so that the royals would not have to be seen in the presence of their servants. The table was to be laid out on the ground floor by the servants, and then a mechanism was to raise it up into the room where the royals could have their party and dinner and whatnot, and then it would be lowered back down. Before the mechanism could be built, a revolution intervened. Well, if you
unfortunate.
If you go now to the big stadiums where we are subsidizing commercial sports, $2 billion a year of taxpayer subsidies to baseball, basketball, football, and hockey. All the new facilities have these luxury boxes. Most of them are owned by companies, almost all of them are, which tax deduct the expense. You want to buy a ticket to a baseball game, you pay with your after-tax dollar. People in the luxury boxes, this is a business expense because they're entertaining clients, and so you're subsidizing this because they're getting a deduction. And guess what? The subsidy payments that you're making for these new stadiums are being used also to create private walkways so that the wealthy who go to these boxes don't have to mingle with the likes of you and me, and we're the ones who are putting up the money so they don't have to be with us. This strikes me as not particularly egalitarian or democratic and much more like the French government of the Sun Kings.
Well, you see, it seems people, how shall I put this, David? When one talks to people about what's going on in their own society at the time, they don't want to hear it because it hits too close to home or it destroys their mythology or whatever reason. When you bring it up, oh, this is what happened 200 years ago, they want to hear that, and maybe that's a way of opening their minds. So let me add that if I understand this correctly, I think back in the days of the French Revolution, Louis XVI, wasn't it, was borrowing like mad to finance this, that, and the other. And how do they pay for the borrowing? Why, they taxed the peasants who didn't even have any bread.
Well, yes, and you know, if, the most widely read literature in Western civilization is Jane Austen. And her stories are about these young women from families that are going to come to the end because there are no sons, and the daughters have to find husbands under that culture, or they face an awful life. And so there are these men that they're looking at, these young men. Oh, Mr. Darcy has 10,000. Mr. So-and-so has 5,000. And what they're talking about is actually the British finance system in the 1700s and the 1800s, where wealthy people loaned large amounts to the Crown and were paid interest. That's what the 10,000 is. And of course, whatever money they could make off their farm and whatnot would supplement this. But they had this cash income from the Crown. And all the Crown had to do then was raise enough taxes from the poor and the middle class, to the extent there was one, to pay the interest. Well, what have we been doing since 1980? Ronald Reagan came in saying he wanted a balanced budget. We last had a balanced budget under Richard Nixon. We have seen budget deficits grow enormously over the years, to the point where the federal debt, not adjusted for inflation, was just under $1 trillion when Ronald Reagan came into office. And by the time George Bush leaves, it will be $10 trillion. And so this enormous amount of money, over $400 billion a year, is just going to pay interest on the national debt. That means it's money we don't have for higher education, for infrastructure improvements, so we don't have bridges collapse and kill people in Minnesota when they're commuting home from work, so we don't have pinch points that are costing us billions and billions of dollars because we can't efficiently move goods around the country. We don't have it for all sorts of things that would grease the wheels of commerce and make us wealthier. And this practice of borrowing is a practice that in the long run will make us less wealthy. The practice of spending money we don't have inherently in the long run has to make you less wealthy, unless you're spending it for things that add value to your society. So if you're borrowing to build the Erie Canal, which means wheat grown in Iowa can now go to New York, and will also mean the end of the wheat business in Rochester, New York, where I live, and new development will have to come along. If you're borrowing to build the Erie Canal, the interstate highway system, to educate young people so that their productive minds will make more value in the future, you're making an investment in the future. That's not what we're doing with our borrowing.
Yeah.
We're, with our borrowing, simply spending money we don't have today. And that we are transferring enormous amounts of money to big corporations and wealthy individuals. I mean, we gave, as taxpayers, we gave one of Warren Buffett's companies in 2006 an interest-free loan of $665 million, and he only has to pay half of it back 28 years from now. Now think about that for a moment. Imagine, Larry, that you bought a house in 1980 and the price of 1980. And up until now, you hadn't made any payments on the house. And this year, you got to pay half in the number of dollars you agreed to back then. No adjustment for inflation. You think that alone might make you a wealthy man?
I would hope.
Yeah, you would hope.
Yeah.
We gave Warren Buffett, another one of his companies, a $100 million gift last year. In fact, the state of New York had to create a special district in Erie County, where Buffalo is. Now, the justification for this is that Buffalo has the highest unemployment of the cities in New York State, and this would create jobs. It was a call center for Geico Insurance, the one that has the cavemen and the lizard. Well, first of all, a competitor closed down their call center, so there were no new jobs created. And significantly, they didn't create this job center in downtown Buffalo where the unemployment is. They created one of the whitest, wealthiest suburbs where there's virtually no public transportation. Yeah. Again, transferring money up the chain of command, benefiting who? The second wealthiest man in America. There's more. Warren Buffett controls an electric utility that has operations in the Midwest, Utah, and Oregon. Oregon passed a law saying whatever income taxes are embedded in the electric rates paid to this monopoly electric company must be paid to the government, or the ratepayers get the money back. Warren Buffett's fighting that like mad because he knows that that company can permanently capture those taxes if they're very smart about how they handle their finances and enhance their profits. In Iowa...
You mean by capture, you mean the money that should go to the government will instead remain with the company?
With the company forever. And in fact, Enron, which did not pay taxes, I broke that story about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, owned Portland General Electric in Portland, Oregon, and people paid close to $1 billion in their electric rates to cover its taxes, money that never got to the government. Buffett owns...
You create shells and subsidiaries.
And buy tax shelters,
yeah,
and do other devices. When I wrote a story about this on the front page of the New York Times, the Edison Electric Institute wrote a letter, as I expected they would, complaining. They didn't say this wasn't true. They just said, we're just doing what the law allows. But now there's one more element to this. Buffett's electric company in Iowa. There used to be 9 corporate-owned utilities, electric utilities in Iowa. They were rolled up into 2. The people in Johnson City, which is a manufacturing town, and 5 or 6 little neighboring communities got together and said, we want lower electric rates. You've consolidated, rates should go down. No way, said the company. So they started organizing to buy out Warren Buffett's company and have municipal power. Everywhere in America that you have municipal power, it's cheaper than corporate power. Well, pretty soon they got advice and recommendations and help from the Iowa Association of Municipal Utilities. There are, I think, 9 little city-owned electric systems. And one day, a guy named Bob Haug, who is the executive director of this Association of Municipal Utilities, was invited to the state capitol in Des Moines. 2 prominent Republican legislators sat him down, and they said to him that they had a bill that would tax these municipal power agencies and would hamstring them from any change in their business model whatsoever in the future. And that unless they promised to never again help people try to buy out Mr. Buffett's company, they had the votes to get this enacted. Or as Carol Spaziani, the retired city librarian in Johnson City and one of the organizers of this drive said, you know, I turn on the television and here are these images and these news stories about this beneficent billionaire, Warren Buffett, who is giving away all of this money. What nobody writes about is how he's gouging the people of Johnson City with excessive electricity rates, and that's how he's making his money.
David, let me ask you a question. I'm going to go back to something we talked about a while ago. You in the course of this discussion, this most recent discussion, you said that some article had been on the front page, and then you also said that this Iowa problem had not been written about. And something you said at lunch really resonated with me. You pointed out some of your own stories that had been, I will use the word relegated, that's the word usually used, to Section B of the New York Times.
Or buried inside the paper, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I was trying to be nice. Relegated, buried, okay. And these are important stories, and you say that when you asked the Times, well, why didn't you put it on the front page? You said, well, you've written about that before. That's old news. Now, here's my question. Isn't it true that every day the front pages of the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, every bloody newspaper in the country is filled with repetition? I don't even read the first 25 pages of the Times anymore because I've read it since 1966. I've read the same stuff.
Well, Larry, I'll never think of you as a guy who throws softball questions. First of all reporters think their story should run on the front page.
Of course.
We all think that.
Of course.
And editors are the ones who decide. And there are times when I've had stories of mine on the front page I didn't think belonged there, but the editors thought that. I have written exhaustively in the New York Times about what's happening to incomes in America, that incomes at the very top are pulling away from everybody else. And we're talking about the top, basically the top 1/10 of 1% and above. And their incomes are exploding. And in Free Lunch, there are lots of numbers about showing how this happens. And the bottom is falling out, they're dropping, and the middle class is stagnant. So yes, editors put the particular story that I did inside the paper. This one showed that from 2003 to 2005, the increase in incomes to the top 1%, just the increase, was greater than the total income of the bottom 20%, who are the poor. In fact, for every dollar the poor had in total income, the increase to the top 1% was about $1.37. And this, although it's short-term data, it reflects this tremendous change that's taking place. Now, when incomes fell after 2000, it was the people at the very top who took the biggest drop, as I reported. And in 2005, the average income in the United States was still smaller than 2000. That's something that's never happened since World War II. It should be telling us something about whether our policies are working or not. Some people in 2005 had higher incomes than they did in 2000. They're the people who make over $100,000 a year. And half of the increase went to people who make over $1 million a year. So the bottom 90% of Americans had smaller incomes. The top roughly 10% had larger incomes, tiny bit larger for people making $100,000 up to $1 million. And then a larger increase for people above $1 million, because the rules we've set in our society are redistributing incomes up. Our national myth is that we have this socialism policy that redistributes down. The reality of the data is that we are redistributing up, and that we don't have trickle-down economics. Remember, that was the rap on Mr. Reagan. We have Amazon up.
Well, David, but the editors of the paper, they don't seem to find those kinds of things worthy of repetition on the front page. But the horse race aspects of Hillary versus Barack, man, every day.
Well, the new things that happen in an election are front page news. And the thing I would focus on, Larry, is except for a handful of people, Peter Gosselin at the Los Angeles Times, who's done some big series, and a few other reporters here and there now and then, why is it that this issue of income redistribution and government taking from the many and giving to the few is not being reported widely?
Right.
You are not reading about it in many, many, many newspapers around the country. And I would think it would be one of the major things. You know, when I became a reporter in the 60s in California, one of the very first lessons I learned was you're supposed to be watchdogging the government. You're supposed to be looking out for the taxpayers. If the politicians want to spend more money, why? What's it for? Why am I going to give up more of my sustenance to the government? If the government needs it, let's hear the case for it. Well, now we have city councils of big cities in the United States where no reporter goes for months at a time to the meetings, where the city budget doesn't get covered at all. I remember reading a story one day in one of the biggest papers in the country about the county budget in the dominant area of marketing for that newspaper, the suburban county. It was this long, and it consisted of the 3 county commissioners, 2 of one party and 1 of the other, yelling at each other over the budget, and it had a single mention of the budget will be X dollars. It didn't tell me how much will my property taxes go up, are they spending more on the sheriff and less on schools, or are they going to fix the potholes? None of the substance was there. And one of the fundamental changes that's taken place is more and more coverage of controversies instead of issues. So I have encountered, I don't know how many people who have said to me, written to me, sometimes left me vicious emails about how we have the strongest economy in history. No, we don't. And nobody who knows the numbers would say something like that, but you could easily get that impression even from watching just television news and listening to the president repeatedly tell us what a strong economy we have when it's just not true.
David, at lunch you told a story that illustrated the extent to which one of your colleagues found Reagan to be an extraordinarily bright individual, and yet, which is contrary to a widely held belief. And yet, wouldn't you say that Reagan is fundamentally responsible for a lot of this? Because true, relying on people like Milton Friedman and von Mises and Hayek, who were his philosophers and his economists, true, he relied on them. True, he carried a lot of people along with him. There was a base of support. You know, the leader better looks behind. If he doesn't find anybody there, he better slow down. Well, he found people there. But this very bright guy, apparently, he is fundamentally responsible for all of this, isn't he?
Yes. Ronald Reagan, whether you love or hate Ronald Reagan, he was a great leader. He really fundamentally changed America. From 1945 to 1980, we had a bipartisan consensus in this country about nurturing and developing the middle class. I mean, this is no nirvana. There were plenty of fights back and forth, but both sides of the aisle agreed that government should be building up the majority of the people to create a better, wealthier society. We had the GI Bill, probably the smartest single thing government's done in modern times.
Can I interject something?
Yeah.
I personally think, and I think I've said this on television, that except for the Emancipation Proclamation, that's the most important single law ever passed in the United States.
I think it's a very, very important law. And by the way, because my dad was 100% disabled veteran, I went to school because of the GI Bill. We had the interstate highway.
A lot of people, that could cause a lot of people to regret the bill.
Well, there will be. We had the interstate highway system built, although it was built at the urging of the Pentagon so that we could move material around if we had to have productivity for a war. We invested in all sorts of things, basic science, education. We had 30-year mortgages developed. And Mr. Reagan came along and said, are you better off? Government is the problem. And persuaded people who were faced with problems. Remember, we had 2 oil shocks, 73 and 79. We had long lines at gas stations. There were a few cases where we had shootings of people in line at gas stations. one or two of those. We had inflation that was scaring people at the time. And I don't think Mr. Reagan intended what happened, okay? I think that Mr. Reagan had a clearly defined set of values. But what we got was not conservative. What we got were radical changes that have, I believe, turned out to work to our detriment. But we live in a society where, presidents and candidates for president of both parties are always saying, God bless America, and this is the greatest country ever. And they're not talking about the real facts of what's going on. Child poverty is increased in this country since 1980, even though we have had divorce rates fall. We have hundreds of thousands of young people who don't go to college because they can't afford it. From tax data, the average income of the bottom half of Americans is $15,000 per taxpayer.
That's I heard you say that the other day. That's an unbelievable figure.
Even if you go, it's right out of the IRS tables.
I mean,
but now some people say it's unfair to use that because there's income that isn't counted, like Social Security payments, and it's taxpayers, not households. But even if you go to households, cost of going to state college now is about $10,000.
Let me make a point about that, David.
Okay.
If you go to households, of course it's higher. That's because women are working.
Yes.
Now, God bless them. This is a terrific development in American society, although it has its difficulties for children. But the point remains that households are just about breaking even today with what one guy used to do 30 years ago.
I want to develop that point, Larry. If you go to household income, even at the typical median level, $50,000, how somebody making $50,000 with even two children can afford $10,000 a year for college for the kids is amazing. And when you and I were kids, college was paid for, it was free to us. Society paid for it because they were investing in the future. Now we're putting roadblocks in the way of the most valuable asset we have. We're subsidizing the owners of baseball teams and football teams, which is lots of fun, but it's trivia. And we're doing it in part by cutting money for this. We're subsidizing Tyco and General Electric through the burglar alarm subsidy that I talk about in Free Lunch, while starving our parks and recreation programs. And what do we get in the big cities because we've starved those programs? Youth gangs. There have always been gangs, not like we have today, not the viciousness, not the reach of them, and it's because of government policy. And the fundamental effect that's taking place here is that government has changed from focusing on nurturing and developing a stable middle class to these other policies. Now, you mentioned two-income households. I think it's a wonderful thing that we don't say to women who want to have a career, you can be a school teacher or a flight attendant and that's it. I mean, my wife's the chief executive or president, she would say, of a big charity that's been very successful and very efficient and lowered its costs all the time she's been there. She wouldn't have been able to do that if she were her mother, in all likelihood. And she's been able to fulfill her talents. But lots and lots of women are out there working at jobs that pay minimum wage or $8 an hour. And the result of the falling wage structure in this country is that the average family with children does 1,000 hours more paid labor today than it did back in the early 70s. 1,000 hours, that's working essentially half of the year. Now, married women with children often have worked throughout history. A Christmas job, a Saturday job, they had what we used to call pin money, but they were not fundamental breadwinners. And there are costs associated with this. We have costs for daycare. And by the way, in Rochester where I live, we have the best daycare system in all North America and Western Europe. And the difference in cost was this much. We spent a lot of money on daycare, but for this much more, we got a fabulous system so that when I arrived in Rochester, New York in 1993, 2/3 of the entering kindergartners failed a test of are you ready to go to school? Could you tie your shoes, left from right, the alphabet, things like that. Today, 2/3 pass. Very small expenditure. Why this program hasn't been replicated all across America is beyond me, but it's a good example of where we're not thinking about using government effectively to improve the lot of the people as a whole, which is what Adam Smith said we should be doing.
David, you're one of the few people, well, I think besides myself, you're the only person I've ever seen say in writing that the reason for this is what you and I call, and nobody else calls, legalized bribery.
Yes.
Now, if you would elaborate on that, I'd appreciate it.
we as taxpayers try to get a free lunch from Congress and the state legislatures by not paying the real costs. People go, oh, a congressman make $162,000 a year. Well, if you have to maintain a household in Washington State or Nevada and a household in Washington, that's not so much money. And you have expenses ordinary people don't have going back and forth. So what happens? Even though there are rules on gifts that are supposed to prevent gifts, and I've gone to lunch with federal prosecutors and bureaucrats who insist, no, we have to divide the check up and everybody has to pay separately.
Yeah.
Members of Congress, I tell all about Signature's restaurant that Jack Abramoff ran and all the free meals, and we know exactly how much they made because these politicians who were getting free, very expensive dinners with expensive bottles of wine, they never left tips for the waiters,
right,
who then leaked this stuff to a reporter named Glenn Justice.
You should always treat the guy in the bottom fairly.
Oh, yes.
He can kill you.
And anybody who wants to investigate reporting, always be nice to the clerks and the secretaries and the people without power.
Yeah.
So members of Congress go to give a speech somewhere. A company provides them with a jet. That was one of the issues about John McCain, who some of his absolute denials have started to show they have a few cracks in them. The company not only has the implied favor, we provided you with a company jet and you're going to remember the favor, but they also means that they have hours alone with you to tell you what they want. And if you're a member of Congress, the reality is that your staff schedules your time so that you are spending almost all your time talking to donors, the representative of donors, the associates of people who are donors who are seeking things from you. Here's a little experiment to try. Call up your congressperson and say, hi, I'm so-and-so. I would like 15 minutes with my congressperson at their convenience, at their office. Just tell me when, anytime in the next 3 months, and I'll come. Now, I've been saying this to people in speeches for 10 years. I've had 2 people call me and tell me that they were asked if they were donors. That question is a crime, but that's what they were asked. I've had 5 or 6 people tell me, a small number of them, that they were asked, after they were asked what they wanted to talk about and they decided to mention something specific, they were lectured on what they should think and told that their views were inappropriate. I've had other people tell me that they were promised someone will get back to you. But I've never had anybody call me and tell me they got a meeting. Now, somebody may have and not told me, but try it. See if you can get one. On the other hand, if you're a big donor...
Yeah, we have experience. I mean, we're aware of what you're talking about. We at this law school are aware of what you're talking about.
Well, so what does that tell us? That tells us that members of Congress are spending their time thinking about and concerned with, as economic theory tells us they should, the interests of the donors who keep them in office. And this system of legalized bribery...
Campaign contributors.
Yeah. And this system I call legalized bribery is the free rides in the jet plane, whether it's to give a speech, go on vacation, go on a $250,000 golf outing. We had this $250,000 golf outing. How do you spend $250,000 on a golf outing? You use gold golf balls? They get meals in restaurants. They get, we actually have members of Congress who've had their spouse chair their election committee, and they've paid them a salary that was a percentage of the contributions given. Now, if that doesn't amount to bribery, I don't know then what the point is of having a bribery statute. I think we can stop that. And one way to stop it is to quit focusing on campaign finance reform. The Supreme Court says, in its view in the Buckley case, that dollars are free speech. Now,
can I make a comment? This is one of the most mendacious opinions ever written. Money is free speech. Money is a way of suppressing what everybody else wants to say.
But Larry, but the reality is this Supreme Court is not going to change that opinion.
Oh, that's true.
That decision is
just venal.
So we have to live with this decision, just like people had to live with the Dred Scott decision. You can agree with the decision or not. We have to live with it. So let's quit trying to.
We fought America's worst war because of it.
Yes, but we have to live with the decision in the short run. My suggestion is let's try something different. Let's reach into the Constitution and find something the Supreme Court can't object to that may fix this problem. And I call this politician finance reform with zero tolerance. We're big on zero tolerance. Little boy in kindergarten tries to kiss a girl, they expel him from school because we have zero tolerance for harassment. Okay, let's apply this idea. We will pay the full costs of Congress. We will pay for you to have 2 households. We will pay all the expenses associated with your job. And we will get a receipt for every bit of this. We'll have somebody in the staff follow you around. Every dollar, every quarter, we will follow. We will put it all up on the internet. Trust me, there are plenty of organizations in Washington that will figure out how to analyze this data. And while yes, the congressman from Hawaii will spend a lot more on travel than the one in Northern Virginia, people aren't stupid. They'll figure out how to look for these things. And I would have it go so far that, you know, Senator, if you're on the Health Committee and you really need to inspect the cleanliness of that sink behind the bar in Tahiti, you go right ahead. You go down there. We're going to have a full record of your trip. Everybody you meet with, we're going to have a notice of who you met with and how long, and a